Sambeta Bhaktavinda Ki Gaur Premanandi. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Sri Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Ajnanatimidandasya Gananjana Shalakhaya Chakshur Unmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandehang Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavam Cha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhunam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakan Vitamscha Hey Krishna Karuna Sindho Dina Bando Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gorangi Radhe Vrindavan Eshvari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Srivasadi Gaur Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Okay. Um, Sasha, did you all stop doing a preliminary kirtan? We only do the one after the class now, or how's that working these days?
But you already did kirtan, so Maharaj. So we do one kirtan like.
In other words, the Jairadama counts as a kirtan, or you already
Yes.
finished doing a kirtan before me? I even got on.
No, no, Maharaj. That counts as a kirtan. So
Okay, okay. So now I know for the future how things are proceeding here. Um, all right. So today uh, we have, as I understand it, chapter 2, text 46. And this verse is about the purposes of the Vedas, how one can achieve all the purposes of the Vedas. Um, is that the correct verse from what I understand, Sasha?
yes, Maharaj.
Okay. So then we'll run right into it here. So here's the verse. Yavan artha udapane sarvata samplutodike tavan sarveshu vedeshu brahmanasya vijanataha yavan ta udapane sarvata samplutodike tavan sarveshu vedeshu Brahmanasya Vijanataha. That's the Sanskrit of the verse. And the translation reads, all purposes served by a small well can at once be served by a great reservoir of water. Similarly, all the purposes of the Vedas can be served to one who knows the purpose behind them. I'll read that again. All purposes served by a small well can at once be served by a great reservoir of water. Similarly, all the purposes of the Vedas can be served to one who knows the purpose behind them. So I'll read Prabhupada's purport. The rituals and sacrifices mentioned in the Karma Kanda division of the Vedic literature are meant to encourage gradual development of self realization. And the purpose of self realization is clearly stated in the 15th chapter of the Bhagavad-gita 15.15. The purpose of studying the Vedas is to know Lord Krishna, the primeval cause of everything. So self realization means understanding Krishna and one's eternal relationship with him. The relationship of the living entities with Krishna is also mentioned in the 15th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, that's 15.7. The living entities are parts and parcels of Krishna. Therefore, revival of Krishna consciousness by the individual living entity is the highest perfectional stage of Vedic knowledge. This is confirmed in Srimad Bhagavatam as follows. Ahobata swapacho togariyan yajjivaga yajjivagre vartate namatubhyam te pus tapaste juhu sasnur arya brahmanuchur nama gurnanti ete ahobata swa pachoto gariyan Yajji Hagre Vartate Namatubhyam Te Pusta Paste Juhu Sasnur Arya Brahmanuchur Nama Gurnanti Ete. O my Lord, a person who is chanting your holy name, although born of a low family like that of a Chandala dog eater, is situated on the highest platform of self realization. Such a person must have performed all kinds of penances and sacrifices according to Vedic rituals and studied the Vedic literature many, many times after taking his bath in all the holy places of pilgrimage. Such a person is considered to be the best of the Aryan family. So one must be intelligent enough to understand the purpose of the Vedas without being attached to rituals only, and one must not desire to be elevated to heavenly kingdoms for better quality of sense gratification. It is not possible for the common man in this age to follow all the rules and regulations of Vedic rituals, nor is it possible to study all of the Vedanta and Upanishads thoroughly. It requires much time, energy, knowledge, and resources to execute the purposes of the Vedas. This is hardly possible in this age. The best purpose of Vedic culture is served, however, by chanting the holy name of the Lord, as recommended by Lord Chaitanya, the deliverer of all fallen souls. When Lord Chaitanya was asked by a great Vedic scholar, Prakashananda Sarasvati, why he, the Lord, was chanting the holy name of the Lord like a sentimentalist instead of studying Vedanta philosophy, the Lord replied that his spiritual master had found him to be a great fool and thus asked him to chant the holy name of Lord Krishna. He did so and became ecstatic like a madman. In this age of Kali, most of the population is foolish and not adequately educated to understand Vedanta philosophy. The best purpose of Vedanta philosophy is served by inoffensive chanting the holy name of the Lord, inoffensively chanting the holy name of the Lord. Vedanta is the last word in Vedic wisdom, and the author and knower of Vedanta philosophy is Lord Krishna. And the highest Vedantist is the great soul who takes pleasure in chanting the holy name of the Lord. That is the ultimate purpose of all Vedic mysticism. Yavan artha udapane sarvata samplutodake tavan sarveshu vedeshu brahmanasya vijanataha. All the purposes served by a small well can at once be served by the great reservoir of water. Similarly, all the purposes of the Vedas can be served to one who knows the purpose behind them. So,
Maharaj, excuse me. I received like reports that sound is still a bit low. Like, is it possible to increase it?
uh, okay, let me try and see if I can do that. I've got a new setup here, so let me remember. Let me go to audio line one here. Let me know if my volume is increasing now. Does it sound louder when I'm speaking now, or does it not sound louder?
Uh, I'm not sure.
So that means it's not sounding louder. Okay, that didn't work. We're trying something. Looks like it should work, but it's evidently not doing that. I've got it cranked up full on Zoom. Sometimes the issue with volume is not from my side, but from the side of the person listening. So that's there. I'm up full blast on Zoom.
Okay. Then.
So let me try one more thing here. Line one. Yeah, this should make, if anything was going to make a difference, what I just did should have made a difference. And if it didn't make a difference, then there's nothing more I can do. At least not right now at this second. Uh, uh, these
Thank
things
you.
take a gradual effort to sort them all out and figure out how to really make this work. All right. So, any rate, we'll try to get back in here. How? Let me ask others. As far as others that are listening to this Zoom conference, do you find my volume lower than, for instance, Sasha's volume?
I don't.
No. Oh,
Yeah, it's acceptable for me. So.
oh, okay. Okay.
Very
So,
clear to me.
yeah.
It's on the soft side, but it's audible.
Really? So it's some people do still find it soft.
Yeah. So just if you feel sound is too low for you, just message me and we will see how many people can have this problem.
Right. Right. Are Atma and Subi here today or not? I'm looking at
I think they are, and yeah, I think.
at least they're not. Will they be here today, or they're just
No,
out
they
of
they
town?
are.
Maharaj, I'm here, and
Okay.
I'm happy to comment that for me, and maybe it has to do with my computer and my connection, but everything sounds good here.
Okay. So yeah, sometimes it's not. The sound can be weak from both ends. It can be weak from my side, or it can be weak from the other person's side. All right. Anyways, we're going to continue on here. So this uh, text today is about how all the purposes of the Vedas can be served to one who actually knows the purpose behind the Vedas. what is then the purpose behind the Vedas? That's the $64 million question. What is that purpose? So let's take a look at it. This is our verse, and we are going to talk about the higher and lower purposes of the Vedas, and we're going to talk about the difference between ritualistic following and true devotion. This dichotomy or contrast exists in all spiritual disciplines. One can simply be a ritualist, or one can actually understand what the real purpose of spiritual life is. But as Prabhupada said in the purport, most people are unaware of what we actually mean by spiritual life. They are thinking that spiritual life is for some other purpose. Sometimes people engage in yoga or meditation, or they go to some church or mosque or synagogue, and their purpose is to perform some ritual which they feel will put them in good stead with the Supreme Person, God, and thus they expect that they will live a happy life. And in what we're going to talk about today, we'll talk about the shortcomings of such a view. But before we do that, this verse is part of a section of the Bhagavad Gita. So the Bhagavad Gita is, this chapter 2 is divided into about 5 sections. At least that's the way Burijan divides them. And the first 9 verses of this chapter, chapter 2 of Bhagavad Gita, were about Arjuna's doubts about the battle that he was about to participate in. And even though he had many doubts, he decided that he would surrender to Krishna and ask Krishna what his or Krishna's advice would be regarding whether Arjuna should fight or not. Arjuna had felt that the battle might actually cause him to become involved in sin by killing people who were his relatives. So he was thinking not to fight the battle. But he decided to ask Krishna what his thoughts were. And then Krishna describes them in the remaining 17 chapters, you know. So this is chapter 2. And the remaining 17 chapters, Krishna tells Arjuna what he thinks is the actual situation. And Arjuna accepts it in the end. Spoiler alert. So at any rate, the second section is the what I call not the body section. So from the first 9 is this sort of dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna. Then beginning with the second section from 10 to 30, Krishna is solidly speaking. So he explains the difference between the body and the soul. We've already gone through that section. And then in the third section, from 31 to 38, Krishna is giving Arjuna some arguments for why he should fight, not from a philosophical level, but from a practical, social, occupational level, because Arjuna is a warrior and it's his duty to fight. So from 10 to 30, he gives him philosophical reasons why he should fight. And from 31 to 38, he gives him occupational reasons why he should fight, because it's his duty. And now this is the section that we're in, this Buddhi Yoga section from 39 to 53. So we're on verse 46 today, which is, you know, somewhat in the middle there. And this Buddhi Yoga is kind of a mysterious term. It's not used very often in the Vedic literatures. And it seems to be a little bit obscure. But Krishna uses it here in the second chapter. And again, he uses it in the 10th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. So he uses it here in the second chapter and in the 10th chapter. And Prabhupada tells us that Krishna hints at bhakti yoga here in the second chapter, but then he explains it more fully in the 10th chapter. So we'll explain a little bit more about what we really mean by Buddha yoga in a minute, but I'm just giving you an overview of how this particular chapter, chapter 2, flows. So finally, after verse 53, from 54 to 72, Arjuna asks 4 questions as Krishna is speaking, and Krishna answers them. He asks, how does a transcendental person, how does he sit, how does he walk, and what are his symptoms? So these are the questions that Krishna will answer at the end of this chapter, 54 through 72. Now, some of you who may have read the Bhagavad Gita or be familiar with it may understand that the second chapter is twice as long as most of the chapters of Bhagavad Gita. Has 72 verses. Most of the chapters have somewhere between 20 and 31 or 33 verses, somewhere in that range. But this chapter has all the way up to 72. And chapter 2 is a summary verse. So Krishna summarizes the Bhagavad Gita in this chapter, and then he will summarize it again in the 18th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. And again, the 18th chapter of Bhagavad Gita is also a long chapter with about 76 or so verses in it. So both the second and the 18th chapters are both summary verses, and both the second and the 18th chapter are both twice as long as most of the verses. So getting back to our discussion here, um, we are contrasting ritual and genuine devotion. We are contrasting Sankhya and Buddhi, and we're going to contrast Nivriti and Pravrti Marg. These are not all synonymous. They're different concepts. And for now, we'll talk about the difference between Sankhya and Buddhi. So in the previous section of Bhagavad Gita, when we were discussing it here, in this section where Krishna explains from 10 to 30 that Arjuna is not his body, nor are the other people on the battlefield their bodies while Krishna is explaining it. That's the section we call Sankhya. And then when he describes Buddha Yoga, he is segueing into a different type of explanation. Spiritual life can be understood from many different points of view. And the reason it can be understood from many different points of view is that everything eventually leads to spiritual life. And if we can take a look at spiritual life from different perspectives, it makes us more sure and solid about what we're doing and how we're doing it. So there are many different ways to view spiritual life, but if we understand how they all are explaining, in one sense, the same basic thing, then we have a clear understanding of it. So Sankhya means analysis or analytical study. So Sankhya Yoga means to understand something in a scientific way by understanding various principles, basic principles, understanding how they interact. And this gives us a platform for seeing the world around us. And this is called Sankhya. And I don't know for sure, but you could probably make an argument that Sankhya in the Latin becomes scientia, which in the modern day becomes what we call science. So Prabhupada many times described Bhakti Yoga as a science. So, at any rate, Sankhya means to understand something analytically in great detail, systematically. So, this is kind of what scientists do. And it's also what those who study Sankhya do. So, Buddha Yoga is not that same thing. It's a different approach, but it achieves the same thing. Buddha Yoga is about controlling the senses. So, before Krishna was giving Arjuna all this explanation of not being the body, of the difference between the soul and the body, the characteristics of the body, and the characteristics of the soul, how the two are intertwined, and how at death they separate. Now he's going to be talking about Buddha Yoga, which is not analyzing the nature of the body and the soul complex, but Buddha Yoga is discussing this idea of how we give up trying to enjoy the world uh, through our senses. Now, of course, for some, this sounds a little frightening. Why would we want to give up trying to enjoy the world? Isn't that the purpose of life? And the answer is no, not exactly. We do enjoy, but if we try to enjoy on our own separately, by marching out into the world and trying to find those objects and situations that give us gratification, that's a sure recipe for failure. I mean, it sounds logical, and it's indeed what mostly 99.99% of people are doing in some way or not, whether they're atheistic or spiritual. And in both cases, people are trying to enjoy the world, and they're doing so by their own device. They have a method, they understand what they think they want, and they go out and they try to make it happen. And strange as it seems, this never works. Um, and as people go on in life, they begin to realize that this somehow or another doesn't work. But what does work instead is trying to please the Supreme Being, pleasing God. And then we do become happy. But this is the idea of Buddha Yoga, that we learn to switch from the idea of trying to make ourselves happy by various kinds of uh, strategies and plans for material gratification to trying to please the Supreme Lord, where automatically we're pleased without any separate endeavor. This doesn't sound very intuitive, but nevertheless, this is the reality, and this is what will actually work. So we're comparing now this process of Sankhya, analytical analysis of the material world and the body and the soul. And now we're talking about Buddha Yoga, which is the idea of controlling the senses. So Sankhya Yoga refers to the philosophy of the difference between the body and the soul. Buddha Yoga has different levels. Sankhya Yoga is not the philosophy of atheist Kapila. In verse 41, which I gave class on about 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago or something like that, we discussed this, that there is a Kapila Dev who is actually an incarnation or a avatar of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And there's an atheist Kapila who lived much, much later. They have the same name, and therefore most people who study Indology and ancient Vedic literatures are unaware that these are two different people, and they have widely different philosophies. So there is a genuine Sankhya and a bogus Sankhya, which is more modern. Now, Buddha Yoga is explained in, as we mentioned earlier, Bhagavad-gita 10:10. And the Sankhya Yoga that we're talking about here, that Krishna is speaking of, is not exactly the same thing as the Sankhya Yoga, even of Kapila Dev in Srimad Bhagavatam in the third canto. So we're talking about a little different nuance of the concept of Sankhya Yoga. But of course, that was in the second section of Bhagavad Gita that we've already gone over. We're now in the Buddha Yoga system, or in the Buddha Yoga section of the third part, or fourth part rather, of the flow of chapter 2. So Buddha Yoga is a synonym for Bhakti Yoga and sometimes Karma Yoga. And Buddha Yoga also means Bhakti Yoga beyond karma or fruit of activity. So in this section, Buddha Yoga essentially is Krishna trying to explain to Arjuna that the yoga that he expects Arjuna to try to follow is not a meditational renunciate yoga. The yoga he's expecting him to follow is a yoga of giving up the fruit of activity, not giving up activity itself. So this is the important point. And Arjuna doesn't get it. So if you don't get it, you're in good company. Krishna explains this in chapter 2. And at the beginning of chapter 3, Arjuna is confused about it still. And then at the beginning of chapter 5, still Arjuna hasn't gotten it at that point. But after chapter 5, Arjuna seems to get it. So there's a difference between giving up activity and giving up the fruit of activity. Krishna is promoting giving up the fruit of activity. He is not promoting giving up activity. So generally, people think of renunciation as living naked on a mountaintop somewhere in some kind of austere setting. But that's not what Krishna is recommending. Rather, Krishna is recommending giving up the fruit of activity, not the activity itself. So a person going to a mountaintop, living with just whatever fruits and berries they can find in a cave somewhere, such a person is certainly giving up activity. But that person is not the following what Krishna wants from individuals. Rather, it's the person who acts in the world. However, instead of claiming the fruit of one's activity, one learns to gradually give up the fruit of activity. What is the fruit of activity? Well, in simple terms, usually it's money. You know, whatever activity we do, we get a result from it. So that's why people work. They get money from their work. And then as a result, they use that money for expanding their various, as we just mentioned, plans and strategies for enjoying their senses. This is why people work. But this, although it seems reasonable, as we said before, it just doesn't pan out. Um, Material happiness never is very long lasting. It's never very deeply felt. And on top of it all, it's also beset with various unpleasantries that we have to live with. So now we've discussed a little bit this difference between Sankhya and Buddhi. So that's the difference between this um, second and third section of Bhagavad Gita and the fourth section, which we are now in, the Buddhi section. So we won't be talking about the body and the difference between the body and the soul. Instead, we'll be talking about action, action giving up the fruit, and inaction. That's what we'll be mainly talking about because we're talking about this Buddhi. And that has all to do with this idea of giving up sense gratification or giving up material activities. Um, so this is briefly chapter 10. And this is the famous verse in chapter 10 that Krishna is alluding to here in chapter 2, or rather Prabhupada's alluding to here. Tesham satata yuktanam bhajatam priti purvakam Dadami buddhi yogam tam yena mamupayantite. Those who are constantly devoted and serve me with love, I give the understanding by which they can come to me. So bhakti yoga is a system where gradually we learn and practice to give up some of the fruits of our activities. We practice giving up some of our time, and we practice on focusing on Krishna some of the time. And gradually, if we continue doing this, the sum becomes greater and greater percentage of our time because we genuinely discover we like doing devotional service. In the beginning, devotional service is not so immediately attractive. We have too many of our own ambitions. We have too many ways that we want to try to enjoy. So we can scarcely get them out of our mind, get them out of our heart. So we try to serve Krishna some of the time. We try to serve Krishna with some of our money. We try to serve Krishna with some of our effort. And this is called mixed devotional service. And over time, if we continue to work to try to please Krishna, we discover we like devotional service, and we discover this strange uh, uh, equation that instead of trying to bash happiness out of the world by imagining what we like and going out, finding it, buying it, and doing it, we are trying to please the Supreme Lord. We discover that this strange equation actually works. And we contrast it with the other one, which everybody else is doing, the strategy of trying to just find what you think you want and going out in the world and figuring out how to buy it, get it, enjoy it, do it, never actually does anything for us. And it becomes lamer and lamer, and it becomes more and more hollow and depressing as time goes on. Whereas we try to serve Krishna, we become satisfied and we gradually lose our um, tendency to want to avoid it. But it takes some getting used to. So this is the idea of buddhi yogam, this gradual change of activity, which gradually creates a change of heart. And eventually we discover that we really like buddhi yoga. So I'm not going to read this because we did this 3 weeks ago. But this is an explanation of buddhi yoga, and you can see it in the purport of Bhagavad-gita 10:10 if you like. That's where it's taken from. So here we are again. The first section was Arjuna's doubts and surrender. Then the second section was this Sankhya about explaining the body, soul, and reality. The third section is also Sankhya, where Krishna is explaining occupational duty to Arjuna. And now we're in Buddhi Yoga, which is section 4, which, as we said, is learning about this idea of giving up the fruit of action, not giving up action, but giving up only the fruit of it. So here is our verse again. Yavan arta, udapane, sarvata samplutodike, tavan sarveshu vedeshu, brahmanasya vijanataha. All the purposes served by a small well can at once be served by the great reservoir of water. Similarly, all the purposes of the Vedas can be served to one who knows the purpose behind them. So, what are the purposes of the Vedas? You can see that this world is a very confusing and kind of messy place. In the 15th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, there's this analogy of a banyan tree. I don't have time to describe it in full, but the banyan tree is the world that we live in. It's a tree that's upside down. The root of the tree goes up and the branches go down, unlike most trees that we see in this world. This tree is described like a reflection of a tree in a body of still water. So if we look at a tree and we look at its reflection in a body of water, that root is also facing upward and the branches are down. The real tree faces root down and branches up. So this world is very confusing. If we try to understand it only on the basis of our own philosophical investigation, we will likely become confused for a long, long time. If we try to understand the world by a helter-skelter approach to the Vedas, similarly, we will become mystified and we won't know what to do, how we can learn anything. We will likely focus on unimportant parts of the Vedas and miss the real important aspects of the Vedas. So, what is the purpose of the Vedas? And Prabhupada has given it to us. And Krishna states it in no uncertain terms right here in the 15th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. Sarva Shachaham Hridi Sanivishto Matasmritir Gyanam Apoanam Cha Vedas Cha Sarvairaham Eva Vedyo Vedanta Krit Veda Vedeva Chaham. I'm seated in everyone's heart, and from me come remembrance, knowledge, and forgetfulness. Now here he's speaking about the Vedas. By all the Vedas, I am to be known. Indeed, I'm the compiler of Vedanta, and I am the knower of the Vedas. So if we want to know what the purpose of the Vedas is, it's right here. It's not a mystery. The Vedas explain what the purpose of the Vedas is. And the person who actually wrote the Vedas is Krishna, or God. Of course, Vyasadeva was the one who turned it into a written form, but Krishna is the original author. So if we want to know about the Vedas, then who better to explain what the Vedas are actually about than the person who authors them? And Bhagavad Gita is accepted by most varieties of spiritual seekers who ascribe to the Vedic writings. So most of them accept Bhagavad Gita. And Bhagavad Gita is a central book to all Vedic approaches. And here, Krishna is explaining what the Vedas are supposed to do. They're supposed to explain him. By all the Vedas, I am to be known. And he's also the compiler of them, and he's the knower of the Vedas. So if someone actually knows what the Vedas are about, it has to be Krishna. And if someone is the source or the author of the Vedas, that person has to be Krishna. And if something is the goal or the real purpose of the Vedas, that has to be Krishna. So he's all those three things: the source, the goal, and knower of the Vedas. He's the source, the goal, and the knower of the Vedas. Now, Prabhupada then talks about this verse, which is also from chapter 15. This is verse 7, which describes what is the relationship between the living entities and the Supreme. Mamai Vamsho Jiva Loke, Jiva Bhuta Sanatana, Manasashta Indriyani, Prakriti Sthani Karshati. Mamai Vamsho Jiva Loke, Jiva Bhuta Sanatana, Manasashtanindriyani, Prakriti Sthani Karshati. The living entities in this conditioned world are my eternal fragmental parts. Due to conditioned life, they are struggling very hard with the six senses, which include the mind. One of the things that's not hard to understand about the world that we live in is that struggle is everywhere. we're always struggling with something in some kind of situation. And mostly, as we said, we are trying to find the right things to plug into our senses that will make us what we imagine to be happy and satisfied. So we are struggling like this person in the water, and Krishna can help us. Uh, and we are a part or a particle of the Supreme Lord. Sometimes it is said that the Supreme Lord is the sum total of all human beings. Well, he's more than all this, the sum total of all human beings. Sometimes it is said that Krishna is the sum total of the universe, and he is more than the sum total of the universe. So, like a fire has sparks coming out of it, the sparks are coming from the fire, but the sparks are still tiny and the fire is big. Sometimes drops of water are evaporated from the ocean and they fall to the earth in the form of rain. So the drops are coming from the ocean, but the drops are not the ocean. They're a tiny piece of the ocean. So we are a particle of God. We are not God, whereas God is the whole. He knows what we're thinking, what we're doing. He knows the intimate details of everything in the universe, whereas we only know a small pie slice of the entirety of what's going on in the universe. We see things through the window of our own eyes, through the mirror of our own heart, in the understanding of our own mind. That's all we see. And that's a very tiny slice of the overall universe, whereas God sees the entire thing. And he sees more. We learn that there are unlimited universes. This is just one. And we learn that there's a spiritual world which is on beyond all the material universes. So there's a lot of stuff beyond what we can see. And we are not just now a tiny particle of God. We have always been a particle of God. And we have always existed. Not only will we exist perpetually into the future, but we have also existed from time immemorial. We have not come into being at some time. Krishna is eternal, and so are we. But we are tiny, and he is large. So that's a basic understanding of the relationship between us and the Supreme Lord, and that's discussed in 15.7. And then Prabhupada quotes this interesting verse. I'm trying to see exactly how this figures into what he is discussing. Aho bata swapacho to gariyan yad jiva gre vartate nama tubhyam tepos tapaste jubuhu sasnur arya brahmana chur nama grunanti ete. How glorious are they whose tongues are chanting your holy name, even if born in the family of dog eaters. Such persons are worshipable. Persons who have chanted the holy name of your lordship must have executed all kinds of austerities and fire sacrifices and achieved all the good manners of the Aryans. To be chanting the holy name of your lordship, they must have bathed at the holy places of pilgrimage, studied the Vedas, and fulfilled everything required. So this is a topic that comes up quite often, that we live in a world where it's quite obvious that things don't appear equal. Uh, there are those who have resources at their disposal and those who don't. They're the haves and have-nots. There are those who are in superior material positions and those who are in inferior material positions. The world has always been that way. And the world will always be that way to some extent or another. That is not to say that we can't help to make things a little bit more equalized. That's not a bad ambition to do. But better is to not so much care about equalizing the material resources or material situations for everyone, which would be very difficult to do because everywhere we look, there's inequality on a material level. But everywhere we look, there is equality on a spiritual level. No one is restricted from spiritual life. No one is barred from spiritual life. We can have spiritual life simply by trying to take it up. We can take the spiritual life if we've been very, very pious and very religious through our whole life and now want to take to a deeper level. Or we maybe have done everything wrong and now we want to take up spiritual life because we've seen the error of our ways. In either case, those who are starting from a point of deep immersion already, and those who are starting from zero or negatives, they can also take to spiritual life. So, as far as spiritual life goes, there is no prohibition or no uh, restriction for people of higher or lower status. On a material level, higher or lower status is certainly taken into consideration at every turn. Everybody knows it well. But on a spiritual level, it is not. So this is the difference. And if we make an effort, we can take to spiritual life, which is what Krishna is recommending for Arjuna. This dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna is intended so that we ourselves can perform a similar activity and a similar strategy of Buddha yoga. And through doing Buddha yoga, we learn again not to give up action, but to give up the fruit of action. All right, so there's more I want to talk about, but I've gone through a lot here, and I want to, at this point, see if there are questions from anyone in our group here that's listening in.
Hare Krishna, Maharaj.
Okay.
Hare Krishna, Maharaj.
Yeah, who is talking?
As Bhakta Dixon. Maharaj.
Oh, okay. What's your question?
My question is, how do we, I mean, technically, or maybe if you can explain scientifically, how do we give up the fruits of our activities?
Yeah. Why, it's simple. We try to do everything for Krishna. And as I said before, generally speaking, uh, what is the most obvious and simple understanding of giving up the fruit of activity is giving up the resources, the money that we get. We need money to live, to have a house, to feed ourselves, and have a family and survive. Those things are undeniable. But gradually, we learn that instead of just trying to utilize all the money that comes our way from our occupation just to expand our family, make our home nicer, to find vacation spots, to get the latest iPhones and flat screens, just to buy a better car, just to move to a better area of the terrain that we happen to be inhabiting. These things are generally the purpose to which we place that resource of money that comes into our lives. So, making money or having some kind of resource as a result of your occupation is not a new thing. This has existed since time immemorial. Maybe at one time the currency or even there was a barter system. That's a whole different story. But the idea is that with some kind of gainful occupation, that gain has some kind of resource that it gives us. Usually in our modern world, it's simply money. You know, we work for some, business, or we work as an entrepreneur, or we work selling something or marketing something or performing some service. And we do this so that people will give us money. And so this is the fruit. This is the palam in Sanskrit, the fruit of our action. Now, in the beginning, we find it's very difficult to set aside some of this because we think, and the world is designed in such a way that this is a very, very strong hallucination, that we need actually every penny and even more just to survive. This is the kind of hypnosis the world puts over us. However, it's not true. Um, and gradually we can learn that it's not true by surrendering some of the fruits of our activity, namely our money, either by giving it as a donation to a temple or to a Sankirtan effort or to someone who is explaining about Krishna consciousness. We can donate it, or if we're a little more advanced, we can utilize the money ourselves in some kind of Krishna conscious enterprise where we're helping people to understand Krishna and we're using our own resources in that direction. That's also using the money in a way that is directly involved in a preaching effort. So that's what we mean by uh, surrendering the fruit of our effort. Is that clear enough, or?
Yes, Maharaj. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Hare Krishna.
I'd like to ask a question.
Yes, please.
Um, when you're talking about Buddhi yoga, you're saying that the Buddhi surrenders his senses, gives up his senses. I'm not quite clear. And then how is it that are we trying to see subtly, in a subtle manner, or are we surrendering to Krishna, who is going to guide us through the understanding of the senses, the understanding of what is? Do I make myself clear?
I'm not sure I understand,
Well, you say surrendering the senses.
right. We're surrendering the
Surrendering
fruit of our activity. I didn't say surrendering the senses. I said we're surrendering the
I'm
fruit.
sorry, the fruits or
Yes.
the senses?
And I've said that the fruit is the easiest way to understand is we're surrendering
What's another
the
question?
money that we get from whatever employment we have. So
Well, this is another question. You're talking about senses and that the Buddhi, there's a scientific and analytical study, and there's
right.
a Buddhi who surrenders the senses. So what do? We actually start to see subtle things in the things that we normally, that we see, we perceive differently, or do we surrender our perceptions to be explained by Krishna?
Well, the way you're explaining it is, I can't understand it at all. We're not surrendering our senses in this.
I
Well,
don't
in
know
one,
what word you use exactly. You talked
yeah,
about Buddhi and senses.
right.
So I'm
But
understanding, how are we supposed to perceive, or we are not supposed to perceive at all, and have Krishna tell us what the true perception is?
no, I didn't say anything like that. What I said was that we are supposed to surrender the fruit. Just try to understand that basic
No, but don't get
mantra.
back on the surrender. What is
Right.
Buddhi? Buddhi is somebody who do something with the senses. What does he do? I mean, there's no way I stop.
Buddhi means intelligence. That's what it means. Buddhi yoga. Yoga generally means giving up sense gratification. That's what
That's
yoga usually
yes.
means. So someone who's intelligent, a buddhi, will give up sense gratification, which is the yoga part. So to be intelligent, one gives up sense gratification. How does one do that? One does it by primarily giving up the fruit of action. And the fruit of action is described as, generally speaking, money. I mean, if you're living in a pre currency society, you will instead barter for what you're doing, you know. And sometimes we get things that are intangibles, and that we can also use for the supreme. Um, Sometimes people give actual gifts, or there's some position, and that position allows a person to do something with that position. So these are all resources that come about. Each human being has something they contribute to society. And because each human being contributes to society, the society contributes back to the human being, and that's called occupation. You know, a person does an occupation, which uh, that human being surrenders their time, and as a result of surrendering their time, they get some resource. In this case, money. And then by utilizing that money, instead of 100% for the expansion of their own strategy for how to enjoy, instead of doing that, using some percentage of that to please the Supreme, then the human being is gradually being purified by that process. Is that getting through, or am I
You
still?
know, and you know, I see Krishna on a chariot or a carrot on a chariot, and he controls six horses, five horses, and this is the control of the sub horses are supposed to be the senses.
Yes.
How do we do that? Do
Yeah.
we in a subtle manner, or do we practice seeing, not hearing, not seeing, um, not smelling, not touching, uh, but really relying on Krishna or relying on ourselves, seeing subtle changes from the spiritual perspective, subtle things from the spiritual perspective.
Well, that I understand what you mean
Okay,
now.
I mean, I was straight.
That we're we are gradually giving our time to Krishna. So we say that we are redirecting the senses. We are not trying to sit on the senses. There are spiritual groups and spiritual communities who do exactly that. Buddhists tend to do that, and some Mayavada, you know, sanghas also tend to do that. They just withdraw the senses. They eat very, very bland, plain food. They fast a lot. They give up all possessions. And that's not at all what Krishna is recommending. Instead, what he's recommending is that we reroute the senses, you know, and we sometimes call this dovetailing the senses. So a person can say they like music. Oh, all right. So now instead of listening to music that degrades a person, we listen to music that is oriented toward the spiritual life or towards Krishna. A person likes to cook. So instead of cooking things that are not offerable, like meat and other kinds of things, they cook only those things which Krishna would like. And they offer them to Krishna, and then they eat instead of just cooking and eating directly. So this is rewiring the senses. We take the senses from directly trying to find what they want to bringing Krishna into the picture, putting him into the loop somewhere. And in this way, Krishna will, as you say, um, Krishna's on the chariot and the senses are like horses. And Krishna will help us to control our senses if we are trying to reconnect the senses to Him and we're doing it consistently. So, yes, this will happen. We don't have to imagine it or to practice something. We just have to follow the process of bhakti yoga. And what is bhakti yoga? It's the idea of whatever you do, whatever you eat, whatever you offer or give away, do that as a offering unto me. So Krishna will say that a little bit later in the Bhagavad-gita. So we learn how to redirect our senses towards Krishna. When we hear something, we try to hear something that has to do with Krishna. If we try to paint something or see something attractive, we try to see something attractive that has to do with Krishna, or we try to do some artwork that's related to Krishna. In this way, the simple things that are part of our everyday world and culture, we are not giving them up. We don't say stop eating. We don't say stop doing music. We don't say stop having relationships with people. We don't say stop looking at things that look attractive. We just say look at attractive things that have something to do with Krishna. Listen to attractive sounds that have something to do with Krishna. Eat food which would be offerable to Krishna. Um, and in this way, gradually, we redirect the senses from anywhere and everywhere to being somehow or other connected towards Krishna. Does that make sense?
Yes, but sometimes we perceive the world um, through our own senses. And what happens when we are redirecting our senses to Krishna? So what happens when you have, an argument with somebody? How is that going to be perceived? Is that going to be perceived as Krishna is behind the scenes in all this, or how's that? Do you understand what I'm talking about?
Well, right. The idea is that spiritual life is gradually learning the techniques. There is some technique to it. It's not random and it's not guesswork. But for thousands of years, people have had certain techniques for bringing the senses into contact with Krishna more and more. And one of the most important techniques, as Prabhupada mentioned in the purport here, is to chant Hare Krishna. So if we get beads, and every day we try to chant Hare Krishna on beads, trying to um, make a vow to successfully complete a certain quantity of chanting every day. If we do that every day, that is the most potent and the most effective of all the techniques of moving or reconnecting the senses. More than anything else, that will reconnect our senses to Krishna. So that's why chanting is the basis of everything that we do. And if we do it consistently, then eventually everything else will fall into place. So that's how I would reply. And, you know, if you're in the society of devotees, you learn from them how to eat those things which are offerable to Krishna, how to engage your time in doing services and activities for Krishna, how to learn to appreciate the artik and the various services that are done to please Krishna. We learn all these things from being in the association of devotees. Does that help to clear things
Yes,
up?
it does. Thank you.
Okay. Okay.
Hare Krishna, Maharaj. I'm sorry. This is Christina talking. Could I just jump in for a sec?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for all of the knowledge you've been giving, first off. But I wanted to say that I felt after I don't know who was just talking. I think it was Susan. I felt like, I was thinking about how, say if someone is coming through the door and I open the door for them and they don't say thank you, I I didn't do it for them. I did it for Krishna, right? I did it for a good, for divine reasons. So if she doesn't say thank you, I don't respond to that, which is then controlling the ego. So I feel like it's just like day-to-day things like that that we don't react to and remember like why we're doing it, right? And that kind of
Yeah.
helps control the ego, which controls the senses, which helps us stay in line with the path that we're on. So I feel like that's like a very practical thing that happens all the time. You may
Yeah.
decide to step aside because people are walking with their dog and the leash is like all the way really long, taking the whole block or whatever. And you just kind of do it for the thought of, you know, they may not say thank you or anything, and that's okay because that's not why you're not doing it for that gratification. You're doing it to stay in line in your path. You're doing it to eliminate your ego. Well, that was my thought that I had.
Yeah, that's also there. Um, there's countless ways. That's the nice thing about devotional service, that it's not a hackneyed or stereotype thing. There are certain, of course, general practices like chanting the holy name that we encourage everyone to do. But there are numbers of ways, and lately I've really been thinking a lot about this idea of, there's a verse, Yena Tena Prakarena Mana Krishna Deveshayat, that somehow or other, that's what this verse is saying, somehow or other, always think of Krishna. And since we're each of us individuals, it will occur to us to think of Krishna, and some techniques will be somehow or another more easy for us than others. And so gradually, through whatever technique we come across, we can figure out how to always try to turn everything into the direction of helping us to remind ourselves of Krishna, or offering it as an action for Krishna. We are doing things to please Krishna. We're not doing things so that we will be recognized. We're not doing things so that we will become wealthy. We're not doing things so that people will be amazed by us. We're just doing things to please Krishna. And as you say, if you gradually start to um, cultivate that way of thinking, you will become more and more Krishna conscious. So there's lots of ways to reroute our consciousness towards Krishna.
Maharaj, I have a question.
Okay.
This is Laja. So,
Wow.
in terms of how a devotee would spend their time in activities, suppose a devotee has a full-time job and spends some time at the temple, spends time chanting. But another important aspect of a particular devotee would be, for example, um, cow protection and being active with the groups that try to minimize meat eating and such, and which can be time consuming. So I'm wondering where, how that activity would be looked upon for a devotee, and taking into account that there's only so much time in a day.
Yeah. What you're asking is kind of priorities, from what I gather. Um, and there's no hard and fast rule on those things. And there's also different attitudes with which, people approach such things. There are groups which promote vegetarianism, which is, of course, good. Um, there are people who do regular charities like uh, feeding the hungry, or providing medical attention, or clothing, et cetera, et cetera. All these things are um, various kinds of welfare work that we can do, that is helping us to get off the bodily platform ourselves and to think of others. However, the best welfare work, para upakar, is to engage in giving Krishna directly to others by ministering to them. We may know how to do it, or maybe we don't know how to do it. But in either case, we can gather with others who are doing it. And, here in New York, we have a group that goes out every day, and they chant and they meet people and they give books. And this is a direct way to help give Krishna to others. So if you know how to give Krishna to others, then you can do your own strategy. However, if you're not so sure or you're not so confident, then to work with others who are engaged in giving Krishna to others is a way that you can learn and gradually gain confidence. So that's the best thing to do. That will have the most effect, both for you and for others. So that's why we are trying to recommend that there are many kinds of welfare work, but of all kinds of welfare work, the best kind is to figure out how to give people a chance. You can't force people to become spiritual. You can't um, demand that people take to spiritual life. Either they're ready or they're not. And if they're not, all right, move on to the next person. There's certainly no shortage of people in New York City. So, that's how I would reply to your question. Out of all things you could use your time for, the best one is to help spread the message of spiritual life to those who are willing to accept it once they hear it. Let me finish up a little bit and then we can do some final questions here. So I wanted to because we talked about this difference between Sankhya and Buddha Yoga. So we've talked about that. Now I want to talk about Nivritti Marg and Pravriti Marg. So this is, as we were saying, two views of the Vedas. Nivritti Marg means the path of renunciation, and Pravriti Marg means the path of enjoyment. So the Vedas give two different paths that one can follow. Pravriti Marg is the lower path. In other words, Pravriti Marg means that one is performing various rituals, and those rituals primarily are performed to please the Supreme. And the hope is that now that the Supreme is pleased, the Supreme will benedict me with some kind of material resources. So this is the Dharma, Artha, Kam cycle. So the Vedas talk about Dharma, Artha, Kam, and Moksha. So Dharma means performing spiritual or religious rituals. Artha means so that one will get material facility. That's what artha is. And kama means that once one has material facility, then one will enjoy with that material facility. So God is there, but God is kind of a middleman in this picture. God's not the target of anything. He's the target of our rituals, but really why we're pleasing God is so that we can get something for God. We hope that by doing some kind of pleasing activity towards God, then he will reciprocate and help us to enjoy in this earth. And generally, this is what most people think that the Vedas are all about. But in fact, this is not what the Vedas are about. Instead, they're about Nivritti Marg, which is the path of renunciation, where one fully realizes that material life is never what it claims to be, that material life always lets you down in so many different ways. And one finally gives up the idea of trying to enjoy material life and tries to please the Supreme. So now the Supreme Lord is the direct center of the target. We're not pleasing him to get something, we're pleasing him, period. It just goes right there and it doesn't go any farther. We're not trying to make the Supreme Lord smile on us so then we can ask him for various benedictions. Instead, we're just pleasing him, stop, end of story. And this is Nivritti Marg. Here, Krishna is talking to the residents of Vrindavan, explaining to them that their Indra Yagya is not necessary, that actually they should serve Govardhan Hill, which is an expansion of himself. So probably this is the hardest point for most people to get if they're inclined toward religion or spiritual life at all. This is the point that most people can't seem to grasp, that we're not trying just to gain material benefit in the material world. Of course, if one engages in devotional service, material benefit will come. And even if someone doesn't engage in devotional service, there will be some residual material benefit that will come anyway from one's past life. So whatever, there will be some kind of material benefit. But this is not the purpose. So many times and many scriptures of the Vedas we read, they will be discussing and explaining this Pravrti Marg system, which we don't care about. We're not interested in Pravrti Marg. We're not interested in those rituals. We're not interested in those benedictions that are offered by those rituals. Instead, we do a simpler, more stripped down version of spiritual life, which is called Nivritti Marg, or devotional service, where we directly serve Krishna. And Krishna is more satisfied by Nivritti Marg than he is by Pravrti Marg. So this is kind of what's going on in our world today, that generally religion in our modern era means rituals. So in Christianity, you have rituals. In Islam, you have rituals. In Judaism, you have rituals. In Buddhism, you have rituals. And for the most part, people think that I'm performing these rituals. And why will I perform these rituals? So I'll enjoy now. And later I'll go to heaven. And there in heaven, I'll enjoy even better than I enjoy here. And certainly, this type of thinking will, if you do it sincerely, gain you admission eventually into heaven. But is that what we really want? The Vedas tell us you can do that, but it won't really make you any happier, any more than becoming wealthy in this material world will make you happy. The happiness of the heavenly planets and the happiness of this material world are only slightly different in degree, that's all. And heaven is not eternal. Eventually, when your pious activities are depleted from enjoyment in the heavenly worlds, you have to come back to this material world. So there's no point in enjoying for a while in the heavenly worlds and coming back to our regular everyday world here. Rather, we should try to please the Supreme Lord and leave the material world altogether and go to the spiritual world. But to go there, we have to want to be there. because everyone there is serving the Supreme Lord. If you don't want to serve the Lord, you wouldn't be happy in the spiritual world, and they don't want you there either. So that's what devotional service is all about. We're learning how to be that kind of person that wants to serve the Lord without interruption and without ulterior motivation. So if we can do that, then we can get our passport to go back to the spiritual world. Otherwise, we'd be better off here in the material world. But here is not a nice place. Even in the heavenly planets, there are problems. So, Pravarti Marg points you at the heavenly planets, and Nivritti Marg points you at the spiritual world. Pravarti Marg is about rituals to please God, but we're not pleasing God for his sake. We're pleasing God for our sake, and we want some material um, rebate from what God has received from us. Now, for Nivritti Marg, we are pleasing God, end of story. And we aren't wanting to go to the heavenly worlds. We want to go to the spiritual world. But to get there, we have to be of the right mentality to enter the spiritual world. And that can be done by the simple process of Krishna consciousness. We continue to practice it long enough. We will discover that we can, and anyone can, gradually develop the right kind of consciousness for entry into the spiritual world. All right, so that's the next thing that I had really wanted to point out. And I'll just quickly go over these because there's not much time. How to balance material and spiritual concerns. These are two verses from the Srimad Bhagavatam, Dharmasya hyapavargasya nartortayopakopate nartasya dharmakantasya kamo labhaya hismritaha. All occupational engagements are certainly meant for ultimate liberation. They should never be performed for material gain. Furthermore, according to sages, one who is engaged in the ultimate occupational service should never use material gain to cultivate sense gratification. So this is the point that we've been trying to make. So what is the right attitude then? This is the next verse, 1 to 10. Kamasya nendriya pritir labho jiveta yavata jivasya tattva jigyasa narto yasche karma bihi. Life's desire should never be directed towards sense gratification. One should desire only a healthy life or self-preservation. Since a human being is meant for inquiry about the absolute truth, nothing else should be the goal of one's work. So this talks about this relationship between desire, between occupation, and the gain that comes from occupation. So gradually, we learn how to pare back our material desires and necessities where, we just want to maintain ourselves as basically as possible and leave the time and leave everything else for being able to serve the Supreme Lord nicely. All right, so now we'll take questions again.
Maharaj, unfortunately, we are like, our time is up. We need to go to the Kirtan part now.
Okay. So do you want me to lead Kirtan or somebody else is going to lead Kirtan?
Please, yeah, if you can.
Okay.
Would be great.
All right, so here we go. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Samin Iti Namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvisesa Sunabadi Paschatya Deshatarine Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Srivasadi Gora Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Ram 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Ram 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Ram 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare Hare Ram Ram Hare Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Ram, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada. Nitai Gauda Haribol, 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 Nitai Gauda Haribol, Nitai Gauda Haribol, 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 Nitai Gauda Haribol. Jaya Nimai Nitai, Jaya Nimai Nitai, Jaya Nimai Nitai, Jaya Nimai Nitai, Jaya Radha Govinda, Radha Govinda Radhe, Jaya Radha Govinda, Radha Govinda Radhe, Jaya Prabhupada, Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada. Jayo Vishnupad Paramhamsa Paravajakacharya Atto Tadasata Shri Mad. Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki.
Right.
Ananta Koti Vaishnava Brinda Ki.
Right.
Grantarad Srimad Bhagavad-gita Ki.
Right.
Sambheda Bhakta Vrinda Ki.
Right.
Gaur Premanandi. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Sri, Sri Guru, and Sri Gauranga.
So,
all right.
If the devotees would like to join me expressing appreciation to Chandrasekhara Swami for his great Bhagavad-gita class and his spiritual association, you can unmute yourself and join me now. Chandrasekhara Swami Ki.
Thank you, Maharaj.